Thank you, sir. Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy is the 14th governor in the Sri Lankan Central Bank's 67th year history. He also serves as the chairman of the Monetary Board. He joined the Central Bank of Sri Lanka in 1974 and served for 15 years in the Department of Economic Research, Statistics and Bank Supervision as a staff officer. He was also seconded to the Ministry of Finance and Planning in the last 8 years during his central bank tenure, where he was a member of the Sri Lanka delegation to the Commonwealth Finance Ministers' meetings, IMF World Bank annual meetings, the spring meetings, and the Asian Development Bank annual meetings. He then joined the Commonwealth Secretariat from 1990 to 2008 and worked as a director at the Economic Affairs Division and Deputy Director at the Secretary General's Office. Dr. Kumaraswamy has completed his undergraduate study at Cambridge University and obtained his doctorate at the University of Sussex. He also represented and led the Sri Lankan national rugby team. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy.
Professor Ranasinghe, Professor Mahanama, Dr. Satarasinghe, Dr. Artigala, senior administrators of the University of Colombo, senior faculty members, and the students who are an important part of the better tomorrow that we're talking about today. Let me first thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a great privilege to join you on this Stat Day 2017. As Dr. Artigala said, there are a number of your predecessors who are making important contributions to the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, and I hope some of you will think of joining what is, in my view, a very interesting and productive career. What I'm going to do, if I may, is to divide up my remarks into two. Initially, I would like to talk a little bit about the prospects, the plans, and the policies of the government of Sri Lanka, and then subsequently talk a little bit about the role of statistics and statisticians. If I may start with the prospects for the country, I would like to make the case that this is probably the most propitious set of circumstances the country has faced for over 50 years now. Because from the late 1950s onwards, for about 25 years, Sri Lanka experienced a secular and dramatic decline in its terms of trade. At that time, it was primarily a tea, rubber, coconut economy, and the prices of all three commodities fell in an almost continuous basis. In fact, if you look at the World Development Report of the World Bank for 1982, you will see a box on Sri Lanka. And there, Sri Lanka is cited as a country which had experienced dramatic and secular decline in its terms of trade, and its development prospects were severely constrained by that exogenous shock, which was experienced on a prolonged basis. At the same time, there was a demographic surge. In the 50s, 60s, and even the 70s, the population was growing very rapidly. So you had this phenomenon whereby the surpluses in the economy were coming down and the population was increasing. So that was clearly a major challenge for the policymakers of that time and a drag on the development prospects of the country. And the problems were compounded by the fact that for a large part of that period, we had inward-looking dirigist policies which were clearly inappropriate for a country with a population at that time of probably about 15 million people. So depending on domestic demand in a country of 15 million people to drive growth and development on a sustained basis was not clearly appropriate. But of course, that was the orthodoxy of the time. And so there were many countries who went down that route, and Sri Lanka also followed such policies which did not yield the kind of development outcomes one would have hoped for. Then in 1977-78, there was the liberalization of the economy, but the payoff in terms of the liberalization policies was severely constrained by the outbreak of the conflict in the early 1980s. But if you look around now, we don't have any such major drags on the economic prospects of the country. In addition to that, we're located in Asia, the most dynamic region in the world. So, in terms of the prospects of the country, as I said, we probably have the best shot for over 50, 60 years, really since the late 1950s. So what about some of the policies that are being put in place to try to take advantage of this favorable set of circumstances that the country currently enjoys? Coming from the central bank, I'll focus primarily on the macroeconomic policies. And here, what we're trying to do in the central bank, and you can see this in the roadmap, the central bank's roadmap for 2017 is on its website. So what I am saying is spelled out in far greater detail in that roadmap. But what we are really trying to do is to change the mold of macroeconomic policy making in a qualitative way. Now, why do I say that? How are we doing that? Well, historically, Sri Lanka has had repeating cycles of stop-go policies. We have macroeconomic policies that create sugar highs in terms of growth and inevitably lead to pressures on the balance of payments and higher inflation. If you look at the last 30, 40 years, you see this repeating cycles. We artificially boost growth through misaligned macroeconomic policies, and the growth goes up, but it is accompanied by higher inflation and balance of payment pressure, and then we go to the IMF and we hold brakes, and then we start the cycle again. And if I'm not mistaken, we've had about 15 IMF programs, which I'm not sure how many countries have had more IMF programs than that. And one of the reasons why we've kind of got away with doing this, basically living beyond our means and then holding back and then going again, is because we were a donor darling for many years. We were a donor darling because, one, we were the second country after Chile to liberalize our economy. And secondly, we had an open political system, relatively open political system. So the traditional donors were very keen to demonstrate very good development outcomes in a country with these characteristics. That is, liberal economic policies and a liberal polity. So we used to get at about 5% of GDP as foreign aid, and 2/3 of that from the concessional windows of the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. And this is, we are talking about 10-year grace periods, 40, 50-year maturity, less than 1% interest. So that's the kind of money we were used to getting when we were a low-income country. And so we used to have these kind of, we'd have a party and then we'd have a headache and we'd hold it, draw back and then have another party, and this went on time after time. So now what we are trying to do is, one, I'll take the three macroeconomic policy instruments one by one. In terms of fiscal outcomes, the budget deficit was the main source of instability in the system ever since sort of the liberalization of the economy, if you look. Large budget deficits pump excess demand into the system, and that creates inflation. And when inflation is high, nominal interest rates are high, and the inflation differential between ourselves and our competitors and trading partners is high, and that puts pressure on the exchange rate. But it's very difficult to run an active exchange rate policy in a country like ours, where there is a very high import component in our basic consumption bundle. So inevitably the exchange rate most of the time is overvalued. So if one were to caricaturize the Sri Lankan economy, it has been a high budget deficit, high inflation, high nominal interest rate, overvalued currency economy, by and large since 1977-78. Now, if you compare that with the successful countries of East and Southeast Asia, that is actually diametrically the opposite of what they achieved. They had good fiscal outcomes, they had low inflation, they had low and stable interest rates, and they had an undervalued and competitive exchange rate. Exactly the opposite of what we've done. So we were second to Japan on most indicators at the time of independence, and now clearly we are well behind many countries when I second to Japan in Asia on most socioeconomic indicators. Now we are well behind a number of Asian countries because, as I said, the basic policy setting in those countries was 180 degrees different from ours. So what are we now trying to do? One, there is a framework for achieving fiscal sustainability that has now been embedded in the IMF's Extended Fund Facility Program, and that anticipates that the budget deficit, which is targeted at 4.6% of GDP, it's expected to go down to 3.5% of GDP in 2020. And I should say last year, one has to give credit to the finance minister and his team, because while the target for the fiscal deficit was 5.7% of GDP, it actually came out at 5.4% of GDP. So they did better than the target. So that's the framework. So there's one framework to achieve fiscal sustainability. From the central bank side, in terms of monetary policy, we are introducing a flexible inflation targeting regime. That you will see it spelled out in the roadmap if you want further detail. But basically what we do is try to forecast what inflation is going to be in 6-12 months ahead, and to take early and proactive action to ensure that the inflation remains within our target, which is 4 to 6%. So in the past, what tended to happen was that we did too little too late. We waited until inflation was very high and then took action, but the monetary policy transmission can take about 12 months. So really, you have to set monetary policy today in terms of what you expect inflation to be in 12 months' time. And for you statisticians, clearly modeling and forecasting becomes extremely important when it comes to this new monetary policy regime that we are setting in, that is the flexible inflation targeting regime. So again, the idea is to have proactive, forward-looking policy making, which we hope will be different from the previous rather reactive and often delayed policy adjustments. Then when it comes to the exchange rate, as I said, in the past it has tended to be overvalued, and what we have tended to do was to use our scarce reserves to defend the exchange rate. And if you look at what has happened, we end up spending a lot of our reserves to defend the exchange rate, and then in the end we have to have a sharp depreciation anyway. Now, two notable examples are in 2011-2012, from July, August 2011 to February 2012, we spent $4 billion of our reserves to defend the exchange rate. At the end of it, the exchange rate was depreciated by 14%. So we simply burnt up $4 billion of our reserves, and in the end depreciated by 15%. It would have been much better to gradually depreciate, probably not 15%, but maybe 10%, and save our reserves. Same thing happened again in 2015. We spent $2 billion of our reserves, and in the end have to depreciate the currency. I'm taking two time slots with different governments. I'm not trying to say one government or the other did this kind of non-optimal things. Everybody has done this, and we really need to get away from it. So now what we want to do is basically manage the exchange rate with the objective of the real effective exchange rate being 100. That gives you, the real effective exchange rate basically reflects the competitiveness of an economy. And what we want to do is to maintain it at 100. At the moment, it's a little above that. So we want to gradually depreciate the currency, get it down to 100, and then manage around keeping it at 100. Now, if our inflation is about 5%, it's a bit higher at the moment, I can explain why that is in a minute. But if we can keep inflation at 5%, the average inflation of our major trading partners and our competitors is roughly about 2%. So we can maintain the real effective exchange rate at 100 by depreciating the currency about 3% a year. So that is the kind of framework we want to get to. So initially, gradually depreciate to get the real effective exchange rate to 100, and then manage it to keep it around 100, which if world inflation, our competitor trading partner inflation remains at 2% and ours remains at 5%, we should be able to keep the real at 100, depreciating by 3%. So there are three clear frameworks that we want to use to set macroeconomic policy, and we want to, we are hoping that by setting these frameworks out, that people will have a predictable and consistent framework within which macroeconomic policies will be conducted, and hopefully that will give a far more predictable and consistent environment for businesses to take their decisions. Now, the other set of points I want to make in terms of the policies of the government is the country is in the process of constructing a new growth model. If you recall, in the period immediately after the end of the conflict, growth, the main impetus for growth came from public investment in infrastructure, a large proportion of which was financed by foreign commercial borrowing. So sectors like construction and transport, which benefited from this large public investment in infrastructure, were the most buoyant sectors of the economy. Now the problem is that that particular model has run out of headroom, because our budget deficit and debt, more particularly our debt dynamics, are such that we can't continue it. I mean, to put it in simple terms, we've basically maxed out on our credit card. So we can't have this foreign commercial borrowing-led growth strategy in the future. So what do we do instead? I mean, it's not rocket science. Many other countries have followed this model. And given our endowment, this is, I think, quite obviously the model that suits us. That is, one, it's a private sector-led strategy, and with FDI and exports as key pillars. Now, I have been a public servant all my life, so I am not one of these people who believes that the private sector is the panacea for all your ills, because if you look around the world, you can get very good development outcomes with different mixes of the state and the private sector. You have China and Vietnam at one end, and much more market-driven economies on the other. So, it's not, one shouldn't be ideological about this. We have to be pragmatic and choose what is best for us at a particular time. And right now, our fiscal and debt dynamics means that the state cannot be the driver of development in the country. Our debt situation, our public debt situation is such that there is no fiscal space for the state to drive the development process. So it has to be private investment, domestic and foreign. This is nothing to do with ideology. As I said, you can get good outcomes with different mixes of public and private sector. But in our case, we have just built up so much debt that the state simply cannot take the lead role. So that's why I say it's private sector. It has to be private sector led. Why exports? We have a domestic market of 21 million people with purchasing power of per capita income of about $4,000. So clearly, you can't sustain 6-7% growth on a sustained basis for 5-10 years, as the countries to the east of us have succeeded in doing, by just selling into the domestic market. Now that's our exports, which were 32% of GDP in 2000, exports of goods have come down to 11% of GDP today, and if you add 5% for services, it comes to about 16 or 17% of GDP. Now the comparable figure for countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, we're talking about 60-70%. So, it's just, we've got it very badly wrong. So clearly, export growth has to be a major part of our future development if we are to attain 6-7% growth. Some people say, look, why do we need 6-7% growth? And the answer to that, in my view, is we've done tremendously well when it comes to social development. If you look at our ranking on the UNDP Human Development Index and our ranking in terms of per capita income, we have the second largest gap. That means we have done tremendously well as far as social development is concerned. So it is possible to argue, well, we have our own way of doing things. Social development, we have got tremendous outcomes. Then why do we need to get fixated with this 6 and 7% growth? The answer I would give to that is, why have we had 2 youth insurrections in the south and a separatist conflict in the north? In my view, there's complex causality behind these events, but for me, the main causal factor was a mismatch between opportunities and expectations for our young people. So we need to grow the cake. We need to have opportunities, productive opportunities for our young people, if we are to meet the expectations of a very aspirational middle class that has emerged in this country. So that's why it's important to achieve 6 and 7% growth, and that's why I think exports, which can drive such levels of growth, become important. And also, if you look around the world, I don't know of any country which has had transformation in export performance without a significant role being played by foreign direct investment. Whether it's a country as large as China or as small as Singapore, foreign direct investment has played a crucial role in bringing about export transformation in terms of improving export performance, because it fills the savings investment gap, it brings in technology, it brings in know-how, it brings in markets. So clearly, foreign direct investment also has to play a role. So what are we doing in terms of policies to support this development model? And there, I will talk a little bit about the investment climate, investment promotion, trade facilitation, and trade policy. Investment climate, the World Bank's Doing Business Index has 10 pillars. Things like paying taxes, construction permits, etc. There are 10 of them. Now, the government has created task forces around each pillar, comprising all the government agencies which operate on that pillar. And the idea is to do deregulation, i.e., to reduce the number of steps that you have involved in each pillar, and where necessary, to infuse technology. So that is one process in terms of improving the investment climate. And the government has also now got a new set of incentives. Up to now, we've had incentives based on tax holidays. We've given away vast amounts of tax revenue, and one of the reasons for the fiscal instability we've had has been the collapse of government revenue. And these tax holidays, etc., amounted to about 2% of GDP on average every year. And we had to do that during the conflict period because there was a high war risk premium attached to the economy. And to get projects over the hurdle rate of return, you had to give a lot of incentives. Equally, at that time, our infrastructure was less well developed and transaction costs in the economy were high. For those various reasons, we had to give away a lot by way of incentives and tax holidays. Now the government is rationalizing that because A, there is no war risk premium attached to the economy, and infrastructure, while more needs to be done, quite a lot has already been done to reduce transaction costs. So the new incentive structure is going to be focused on investment, not on profits, but on investment and capital formation. So there will be investment allowances, accelerated depreciation, etc., to focus whatever incentives on actual investment, i.e. capital formation. So that's what's happening in terms of the investment climate. In terms of investment promotion, in the past we've had rather unfocused investment promotion activity. but I don't know, some of you may have read about Ricardo Hausmann and his work and what he's had a team from his center at Harvard working with the Board of Investment. And they have a methodology whereby they identify subsectors which an economy can jump into from the current structure. He talks about monkeys going through the forest, jumping from tree to tree, and each time going higher in terms of export diversification and export complexity. So his team has helped the Board of Investment to identify 5 or 6 subsectors where they think Sri Lanka can jump to. And within those subsectors, they are trying to identify particular firms to target. For instance, Samsung transformed Vietnam's export performance. At one point, 40% of Vietnam's exports were from Samsung. Intel transformed Costa Rica. Something like 60% of their exports were associated with Intel. So if you can get 2-3 of these major players to come, they can help you absolutely transform your export performance. So the new investment promotion strategy is to focus on particular subsectors, and within that to focus on particular companies. Then on trade facilitation, very soon there will be a single electronic window at the customs and a one-stop shop in the central clearance unit. Now that should reduce significantly the costs of doing cross-border trade in the country. But probably the major effort, and it is controversial, I know, but if we can work it well, the real prize is related to our trade policy. Let me say, as part of this, before I get on to the trade negotiations and the trade agreements, as part of creating the right environment to finalize trade agreements, the government has it is developing a national trade policy which will give us an integrated framework within which trade policy can be pursued. And there is also a trade adjustment package that is being worked upon with the help of the World Bank and the International Trade Center to help our companies to become more competitive, to help retrain our workers. So there will be a trade adjustment package also as part of this trade policy. And there is an anti-dumping legislation which is very close to going to Parliament. And side by side with that are these trade agreements which are being negotiated. Now, we already have a bilateral agreement in goods with India. There are shortcomings, and in this next round of negotiations, the Sri Lanka government is focused on first getting an early harvest in terms of addressing the shortcomings in the existing bilateral agreement in goods, and then to move on to widen the agreement to include services, investment, technology and training. A similar agreement is being negotiated with China and Singapore, and we also have an agreement with Pakistan, a bilateral agreement in goods with Pakistan, which is being invigorated. And on top of that, GSP Plus is most likely to be restored in May or June. The European Commission has recommended the restoration of the GSP Plus, and usually the European Parliament follows the recommendation. So if you take all that together, right, remember now there are 190 odd countries all chasing foreign direct investment. So you have to have some means by which you can differentiate yourself. And Sri Lanka, if all this works out and we are able to secure deals which are actually beneficial, clearly one has to make sure that the agreements are beneficial for the country, then what we will have is preferential access to a market of 3 billion people. That's China, India, Europe, Pakistan and Singapore. As far as I know, only one other country has preferential access to both China and India, and that is Singapore. So no other country can say they have preferential access to those two markets. So, okay, having these trade agreements will create new opportunities for our own exporters. But arguably the bigger prize is to leverage what they call the trade investment nexus. That is, to tell the Chinese investor, you can come to Sri Lanka, export on a preferential basis to India or Europe. Tell the Indian investor you can come to Sri Lanka, you can export on a preferential basis to Europe or China, etc. So you can go around. So you can see that this is an enormous potential. Of course, we need to get our act together to be able to absorb this. First, we need to negotiate trade agreements which are beneficial to us. And there, one thing to keep in mind is clearly there is a big asymmetry between economies like China and India and ourselves. But trade agreements based on non-reciprocity and special and differential treatment, which have safeguards built into them, and this is not rocket science. These kind of trade agreements between smaller and bigger countries have already been negotiated. So we can take it off the shelf and see how we need to protect our interests. And we also, need to, I think, take into account the fact that the Sri Lankan market is not something that the Chinese and Indians are desperate for. I mean, in the case of the Chinese, they would normally not get out of bed for a market this size. But there is a geopolitical strategic factor which we can use to our advantage. We need to box cleverly and take advantage of it without compromising our sovereignty in any way, but balancing off different interests with astute diplomacy. It can be done, and if we do it cleverly, there's an enormous prize to be won. So those are some of the policies. Let me quickly now go through the, I've gone far too long. Go through this. I'm going to step down a bit. Okay. So I hope you can see me. Can you see me? Okay. On the role of statistics and statisticians, the role of statistics is becoming increasingly important today with the advancements in technology revolutionizing the way data is collected and processed. Statistical information provides a useful basis for the formulation of decisions by individuals, by businesses, and policymakers. The effectiveness of decision making depends on the quality of the statistics collected and the capability for interpreting them. Statistics are also required to communicate the decisions taken to the public in a credible and consistent way. In almost every aspect of life, there is the need for accurate and reliable statistics, timely and continuous assessment of underlying relationships among economic and business variables are vital in all economies. From a macroeconomic policymaking perspective, statistics provide contemporaneous as well as forward-looking information which is useful for both monetary and fiscal policy. As I said, we are now moving towards a much more forward-looking monetary policy framework, and clearly statistics will become much more important. So what are the main functions? One, statistics is a science which is continuously evolving, and it is a subject that explains how to deal with variability in a scientific manner. Statistics can be used to present facts in a defined form rather than in the form of broad generalizations. Statistics helps to convert complex data into understandable, summarized forms which could be presented in a user-friendly way. And it is clearly at the basis, it is the basis on which hypotheses are formulated and tested, and it is the basis on which modeling and forecasting takes place. Now, if I talk a little bit about some of the statistical techniques used within the central bank, forecasting techniques. Within the central bank, we have evolved from univariate forecasts to more sophisticated multivariate systems of models with the progress of the statistical science and increasing availability of data with high frequency and timeliness. The Central Bank of Sri Lanka has developed updated, sophisticated modeling techniques such as factor-augmented vector autoregression models and the Bayesian vector autoregression models for near-term forecasting and neo-Keynesian open economy models for medium-term forecasts. These have become common workhorse models in forecasting and policy analysis within the central bank, and they play a very important role in the everyday work of the organization. In the current fast-moving world, forward-looking information in terms of expectations is essential for central banks for effective decision-making. Monetary policy works with long and variable lags, and therefore relying on current available information is not sufficient to determine the future monetary policy path. Therefore, central banks need to monitor forward-looking indicators. In this regard, the central bank now conducts a series of surveys, 1 on inflation expectations, 2 on credit conditions, 3 on the business outlook, and 4 on the Purchasing Managers Index. This is done to gather expectations of market participants. These surveys assist in deriving indicators of expected inflation as well as information on potential future price pressures in order to react in a timely manner to address such pressures. The central bank has also created a data library which is now available on the website. How many, is it 600? How many? 6,000, sorry. 6,000 data series are available. I would encourage you as statistician, if you haven't already done so, to access it and have a look at what is possible. The central bank also now complies with the IMF Special Data Dissemination Standard, which A, raises the standard of data collection and dissemination, and B, also makes international comparison easier. Now, the central bank has 2 key objectives. One is price and economic stability, and the other is financial system stability. And here again, in the financial system stability, in that area as well, statistics are extensively employed in assisting the formulation and implementation of proactive macroprudential policies to maintain financial system stability. Moreover, statistical analysis is employed in identifying system-wide vulnerabilities and threats to financial stability from the build-up of risks and their transmission through the interconnectedness of financial institutions. Further, statistical forecasting techniques are employed in stress testing, which is used in identifying and assessing systemic risks and vulnerabilities. Let me finish let me conclude by stating that I am confident that Stat Day 2017 will achieve its objective of highlighting and creating awareness about the pivotal role that statistics plays in day-to-day life. I wish all of you the best for a successful event and congratulate all of you in organizing what is a very important event which you have successfully conducted, I believe, for 14 years now. And I would like to conclude by drawing your attention to a quote by Sir Arthur Lyon Bowley, who was an English statistician and economist. He pioneered the use of sampling techniques in social surveys. He said, "The proper function of statistics is to enlarge individual knowledge and experience." This is a noble objective and highlights the importance of statistics in all our lives and the importance of your theme today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, sir, for gracing this occasion and enlightening us. And so please remain on stage to accept this token of our appreciation. Secretary Deshani will present the token. Now it's time to showcase the talents of our alumni. We welcome Ms. Gara Fernando to conduct the student session.